Louise Rouse, thank you very much for an interview. How are you?
I'm good, Edward, and you?
Very well, thank you. I wanted to start by asking you to describe what you do and how it all began and what it's all about.
Okay, so what I do is I tend to advise non-profit organisations who are interested in bringing primarily environmental but sometimes social issues to the attention of institutional investors, shareholders in large FTSE 100 or FTSE 250 companies. And my job is to translate an NGO concern into a risk message for an investor so that institutional investors who make their decisions on a risk-return matrix can see that this particular environmental or social issue is of relevance to their decision making and hopefully will make a decision that aligns with the interests of the NGO. And so examples of that would be that I advised Greenpeace UK around informing institutional investors about the risks of Shell's plans to drill in the Arctic, trying to encourage investors to recognise those risks and scrutinise Shell's plans much more, which they did. I work as a consultant to a number of nonprofits at the moment. I previously worked as the Director of Engagement and Campaigns at Share Action, where I did similar work, but obviously Share Action has a much broader remit around the accountability of the investment industry itself to the millions of people whose savings are managed by them. And prior to that, I actually was a corporate lawyer in Ireland. So I used to be a banking lawyer with a large firm in Dublin. And I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed the law. A lot of lawyers actually don't like the law, but I really enjoyed the law as an intellectual exercise, and it was a really great firm to work in. But I left in 2008, which was pretty good timing in retrospect, because I felt that I should probably spend a little bit of time doing something that was more contributory to the world around me and to use the skills that I had and that the firm had taught me to do something more than just securing the wealth of private individuals, which at the end of the day is what my job sort of boiled down to.
Thank you.
So that's kind of,
That's very helpful. And what are the challenges? How do you make an argument to a big investor about stranded assets, about fossil fuels, about what they should and shouldn't be doing?
So it's not as challenging as it was, I suppose, because concepts like stranded assets and the economic risk of climate change are actually being discussed and internalised within a lot of big investment houses, certainly. So I think it's to understand what the investment community is talking about and what they're thinking about, and then sort of looking at your particular issue and seeing how does it fit within that frame. Traditionally, I would say many NGOs took an approach of telling the investment community about something that was terrible and telling them they must do something. And while many of the individuals that were sitting across from might have agreed on a personal level, there wasn't really anything there that they could do within their professional context. So, for example, if we take a very tangible example like the Arctic project, certainly one of the arguments around that was Shell was spending billions of shareholder money on something that was likely to end up being a stranded asset. It was a very long life project. Oil wouldn't come to market even if they found some for decades, at least 2 decades. Therefore, they would need a very high oil price, 2030 and beyond, for that project to make money. So that's a big bet if you're putting out billions up front on the basis it's going to be a $100 plus oil price 2030 beyond for several decades. There's a very high risk of it being a stranded asset. But the oil industry is an industry of exploration and extraction, and they have lots of exploration options on the table, and you win some, you lose some. That's part of the game. So shareholders aren't going to try and shut down every project that mightn't be a winner, because that's part of the process, and the oil companies are the experts. So I would take the approach of you need to look at what are the other risks that surround that project, which might encourage investors to scrutinise it further. So obviously it was a province where offshore no one had drilled before successfully, and there was no infrastructure, no pipelines. How the oil if found was ever going to get to shore would be an issue. It was the subject of a massive campaign by Greenpeace and a number of other NGOs around the world. 7 million people eventually signed petitions in various forms objecting to Arctic drilling. It was becoming a media circus. So what I tend to do is try and gather together a number of risks, and you almost build a matrix of risks for the investor and show that there's a clear risk of the asset stranding, it not coming to market, and you can demonstrate that by looking to the cost of it, so where it sits on the cost curve, so work Carbon Tracker have done and various databases help you identify that. You show that on top of that, this project is going to be a really risky project in terms of reputational risk, media risk. That in itself isn't necessarily a problem. Oil companies do not have the best reputations in the world. The issue is if you have a spill in the wrong place and there is publicity attendant to that, it can be very serious. BP's Deepwater Horizon attracted far more publicity than similar scale spills, that happen over time in places like Nigeria, for example. So the fact that American media was covering the Arctic intensively, certainly in 2015, highlighted to investors that was there a spill in that country, that would be much greater than simply the total of the oil spilt. It would be a huge disaster and could bring Shell to the brink in the way that BP was brought to the brink by Deepwater Horizon. So you try and package all of these things together and present them very objectively, credibly referenced to investors, and then I try to provide them with tools in the form of questions that they can put to the companies to try and get to the bottom of the issues that I'm raising. Again, sometimes people will go to investors and say, there's this awful thing and you must do something. Again, the investor may even feel there is something that should be done even from a risk-return framework, but isn't quite sure what that is, will probably go speak to the company, will get a very detailed answer probably from the company, and will feel, well, they're on top of it, because they don't, of course, have the necessary information to scrutinise that and interrogate it. So I try to, my legal training, provide quite precise questions that investors can ask that will help to interrogate the information the company is giving them, so that they can go beyond a sort of, just a first fence conversation. They can actually counter that and get into a more detailed conversation around issues. One example is that Shell's plans in 2015, kind of did for them really, in the sense that they planned to drill 2 wells. They then were alerted to the fact that a rule had been introduced to protect walrus breeding grounds in 2013 that meant drilling rigs had to be a certain distance apart. That was found and highlighted by a very detail-orientated lawyer in an NGO who literally found the regulation and got out a ruler and measured the map and the scales. And when that was put to Shell, they said that it caught them by surprise. NGOs found that Shell's American operation had actually sent in a letter objecting to the regulation when it was being negotiated. So it hadn't taken the entire organisation by surprise, perhaps it had taken the headquarters by surprise. So we fed that detailed information to investors who were therefore able to challenge the company on that claim that it had caught them by surprise, or to say, well, you actually lobbied on this. So what other communication breakdowns are occurring? How can we be confident that there isn't a big problem in Alaska that you're not aware of? Which was a consistent theme since 2012 when they first went to drill, and they couldn't get their full permits to drill because they kept having setbacks and mini accidents and boats not being fit for purpose and so on. So that idea of a breakdown in communication, which again was at the heart of BP's disaster, being able to highlight that is of concern to investors. Does HQ know what's happening on the front line? So
very interesting.
That's kind of how I go about it in general terms.
Thank you very much. You and I first got in contact about fiduciary duty, and it was soon after the K review, etc. And you gave a magisterial unpicking of the issue over the phone for a brief that I had to write. And I wondered if we could sort of revisit this issue, because it so often appears. What is fiduciary duty? How is it currently interpreted? And how could it be interpreted more broadly to the benefit of climate action?
Sure. So the caveat on this is that I have not looked at this issue in precise detail in some time, because although it was very much part of my job in ShareAction, it's far less part of my job now. But fiduciary duty, first of all, various people owe various types of fiduciary duties in the world. It's a legal concept, but within the investment space, it primarily is something that pension fund trustees, so the board of an occupational pension scheme, which is trust-based, have fiduciary duties to the people whose money they manage, the individual workers, the savers. And fiduciary duties are, to act in the best interests of those people. That's really how it can be encapsulated. There's individual duties to act prudently and so on, but it fundamentally comes down to this idea that the law is saying you are in a position of trust in which you are making decisions on behalf of someone else, And in that position of trust, you must always make those decisions in the best interests of the people you're acting for, and for no other reason, which is a very sound principle. Unfortunately, that has been, in the context of pensions particularly, interpreted very narrowly traditionally to be, we must act to generate the greatest financial return for our beneficiaries, and we cannot consider anything that might be considered ethical or environmental. And there's sort of like two big problems with that. The first, that best interest is immediately reduced to financial interest. And secondly, that in considering what is a financial interest, they exclude entirely the idea that an environmental or ethical issue might have more than one aspect. It might be environmental, but also financial. It might be ethical, but also financial. And so that has led to decades of inertia and inaction within the pensions system, where issues like climate change are simply not considered because the trustees are operating under misunderstanding that they actually cannot consider them because they also happen to be environmental issues. And in financial terms, financial interest has been defined very narrowly as short-term, immediate quarterly returns, triennial valuations of pension funds. And so fiduciary duty, as misinterpreted, has contributed to the tyranny of short-term thinking, which is, of course, the enemy of long-term interest, and nothing could be more of a long-term interest than a pension, which you ideally should enter into as young as possible, but not draw on until one is at least 60. So that's the ultimate long-term interest, and yet the entire governance structure around it is operating towards short-term thinking. So Sheer Action did a great deal of work. I must credit my colleagues at the time, Catherine Howarth and Christine Berry, did a huge amount of work on a research report examining what exactly was fiduciary duty and unpicking these misunderstandings, which had arisen from a very famous case called Cowan v Scargill, which involved the trade unionist Arthur Scargill trying to get their pension fund to exclude all competing stocks to coal, which again, was sort of in the union's interest, he thought. But the findings of that case have sort of been, unfairly restricted. I think the judge himself subsequently said that his judgment was much broader in sweep than it is often interpreted. That report from Sheer Action led ultimately, through a lot of work, to John Kay including fiduciary duty in his review of UK equity markets as an issue that needed to be looked at. He recommended that the then Secretary of State of the Department of Business, Dr. Vince Cable, commission a Law Commission review of the issue, which happened, and then the Law Commission published a report, which was very good. It clarified many of these issues. It made precisely the same points, that ethical and environmental issues can be financial issues, often are financial issues. Where they are financial issues, they should be considered by trustees. It looked at long-term financial issues, not just short-term financial issues. It clarified that financial interests are not the totality of the interest that beneficiaries might have, but there's very clear rules and standards around when you can take into account issues other than pure financial interest. But one example might be when a majority of members of a fund indicate that something is unacceptable to them and is not in their best interests, and then the trustees could make a judgment that that majority of members, and they're acting in their best interests, and there's no financial penalty to making that call. So it was a very good report. We in Sheer Action felt at the time that were that report not incorporated within the legislative body, that there was a risk the misinterpretation could continue, because it would simply be a report, and that would just be one of many reports. And although lawyers might refer to it in opinions, it still, we felt, didn't necessarily have the standing that legislation would have. And so the next strand of work in Sheer Action began to try and encourage the coalition government at the time to introduce a clarifying statute, which would simply put the findings and conclusions of the Law Commission into statute, so that it would be very clear for pension trustees for decades to come, when they would seek legal advice, precisely what they could and could not do. And progress was being made, and I think a consultation was actually underway, and of course then the coalition government came to an end and we had a new election, and the new government at the time which was David Cameron's government, didn't proceed with it, which was unfortunate because I think we've seen, I haven't read it all, but I saw research recently coming from the Smith School which suggests that climate change is still not a significant topic of conversation among investors in, I think they looked at Australia and the UK, and despite the very strong evidence, I would say irrefutable evidence of the financial impacts of climate change, both the impacts of climate change should we not mitigate it, and the impacts on certain sectors should we mitigate it in the form of stranded assets. Pension fund trustees don't think it is an issue that they have to consider, whereas I think it very much is an issue every pension fund trustee board should be talking about.
Despite Governor Mark Carney's speech, despite this disclosure report that's just been published, Mike Bloomberg et al., despite the efforts of many who table these questions in shareholder meetings, etc., it's a very big ship in a sense, a tanker, and it's hard to shift. But do you feel that it is moving, and do you feel that this is an unstoppable development, this whole effort to try and shape the way pension funds think, or we're only just beginning in a sense? It's hard to gauge.
Yes, I mean, I think it is, the tanker analogy is fair. I mean, this is huge. It's the whole system in a way that you're trying to move. And so I think it is moving now, and I don't think it will be stopped. I think that, if you look more broadly, even the Paris Agreement, I think was surprising to people. The striving for 1.5 was a pleasant surprise. Now, it's terrible that striving for keeping temperature increase to a situation where we won't lose lives and huge biodiversity systems, that's a huge amount of progress. But given where we were 2 years prior to Paris, I think the inclusion of 1.5 was a pleasant surprise. And the quick moves to ratify it around the world and so on. So there has been progress within the pension system itself. I just saw, Client Earth and Against Your Action, have written to the pensions regulator and to the body in charge of the local authority schemes, asking the regulator to investigate the poor responses the individual members of certain local authority funds have received when they've asked about the consideration of climate risk by the trustees, and the pension regulator has previously said finds it surprising that the idea that climate change is being talked about. That is a movement even within the pensions regulator in terms of climate change being looked at. So I think we have progress, and the more individuals continue to press their own fund, the more these questions begin to be asked. This will become part of the marketing and promotion of, certainly, even if you leave aside trust-based occupational schemes, but most people are moving into contract schemes, which you have a pension from a commercial actor, the likes of Standard Life or Aviva or Legal & General and so on. And the more that customer demand increases, the more the marketing department gets involved, the more the business development department gets involved, and then it just becomes part of doing business. And it's out of this sort of silo. So I think there is unstoppable movement. The question that remains is it sufficiently speedy? Because while the transition to a low carbon economy and so on is likely inevitable, the timing of that transition is the difference of billions of lives and biodiversity. So it is the speed with which it moves that is an issue. But you look at the divestment movement on fossil fuels, the speed at which that has gathered and captured the public imagination, particularly among younger people and students, that's really relevant in the context of those people entering the workplace. You want them to carry that divestment energy and attitude into their selection of a pension fund. And that will be millions of people coming into pensions. And so that's really positive. And tipping points, these things can happen very quickly. The climate march, the size of that march in New York, again, that took people by surprise. The speed at which the divestment movement has grown globally, that's exponential growth. And so there are reasons to be optimistic, but we can't underestimate the sheer scale on the one hand of the system we're trying to shift, and the lack of resources to this particular issue within that system on the other, which is sort of the worst of both worlds. A huge system with very little resources attached to this issue.
Very well put. And I follow the Church of England's efforts with others in this sphere, and it's interesting how they don't a priori divest from the fossil fuel companies, but they do engage very actively and with strength with the companies and challenge them to prove that their growth trajectories are consistent with the Paris Agreement, which, all being equal, really, they're not. But at what point does the church then become ethically committed to divestment rather than to ongoing engagement? Or, is this strategy of progressive engagement with honest questions being asked the best one, so that the companies sort of go on a journey with an active investor rather than simply being divested?
So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a yes and, as they say in improvisational comedy. I think that, so the work I do, I don't personally work on divestment professionally. My whole job is really to get investors who might potentially engage with companies to engage with them in a way that will achieve the goal that I want. So ultimately, engage with BP to question their decision to drill in the Great Australian Bight. My goal, and the NGOs I work with's goal, is to stop them drilling in the Great Australian Bight. An individual investor divesting from BP because they were planning to drill in the Great Australian Bight probably wouldn't shift the company's decision. So, there. So divestment and engagement serve different purposes. The Church of England, the Church Commissioners, and then sort of the staff there led by Edward Mason have done great work at Exxon, along with New York State Fund, pushing that company, highlighting how far behind even its peers it is, which is saying something. And they clearly have objectives set around that engagement in terms of what they expect to happen by when. For me, that's the issue. It's what, if an investor, particularly an investor which can take ethical considerations into account, whether that's a philanthropic foundation or an endowment or a church in relation to its own funds, where it can make ethical decisions. It will be approaching it from a climate risk point of view, certainly, just for good financial sense, but it will have the overlay of the ethical issue of climate change and the need to do something. And within that frame, for those ethical investors, I think the issue is, what is this thing we can do that will have the greatest impact on that issue of ethical concern? And I think it's legitimate to say, well, we have engaged on lots of issues as investors. We want to pursue an engagement route. The qualification I would put on that is, are there set objectives for the engagement? Are there milestones by which success will be measured? Is there an escalation strategy if progress has not been made? And is there ultimately an exit divestment path if you feel you're going to get nowhere? And I'm not privy to the private decisions of all these individual investors, but that is the conversation I would have. And I imagine that there is that plan with many of those investors, that they see this as a way of exercising influence, and they have an idea of what success would look like, and if success is not met, that they should divest. I think if it's on any issue, really an endless engagement, one has to query, why is one engaging? If it's an issue, so if we even leave aside ethics, we even leave aside climate change for a moment, if one is engaging on, say, a labour rights issue, and you're a mainstream investor, therefore you're engaging on that issue because you believe it's a risk to the company, because otherwise you wouldn't be engaging. If no progress has been made and you're hitting a wall, why on earth would you stay in the company if you've regarded it as a risk, so much so that you've dedicated resources to trying to fix it, and you're simply not fixing it? One would assume that at a point you would decide, we're not going to be able to mitigate that risk save by exiting. Or else one might question the allocation of staff resources on an issue that was not so serious as to eventually need an exit strategy. So this is an issue around, is engagement by institutional investors objective driven, with milestones, with escalation strategies, all built in from the outset? Or is there just sort of conversations happening? And, the risk of tick box, that we had X number of meetings with the company about Y number of issues, isn't, hugely indicative of whether progress has been made. In terms of the second question sort of contained within your question, which is, do we think we can bring these companies along with us on the journey? I remain skeptical, highly skeptical, mainly because of their own words, not because of anything I'm putting in their mouth, but mainly because, you listen to certainly the UK majors to whom I pay most attention, Shell and BP. They tell us that fossil fuels will remain the dominant part of the fossil fuel mix for most of the century. Renewables simply won't get to scale. They don't believe 2 degrees is going to be achieved. And if they don't believe 2 degrees is going to be achieved, that would suggest that they are planning for a world where 2 degrees is not achieved. And so otherwise, again, there's a disconnect between the assumptions they're making and the plans they're implementing, which would be its own problem. So unless they can very quickly pivot into, a well below 2 degrees trajectory, then I'm not sure how we can feel comfortable with the idea that we're going to bring them along with us on the journey. And again, I think for investors, they will have to recognize, when that fork in the road is coming. And it's not necessarily that, they're going to that's when we need to divest. I think you're looking at public policy space. You investigate and look at the various measures that go through European and American legislatures, federal and state, and you see that the fossil fuel industries and related industries, chemicals and cement, high carbon industries, actively lobby against measures which would bring us greater progress towards a well below 2 degrees trajectory. Now, on the one hand, that's rational behaviour by actors who've identified a well below 2 degrees trajectory as potentially a risk to them. But it's not in the interests of their shareholders who, as owners of a much wider section of the economy, recognise the absolute financial imperative to remain below 2 degrees. So one is this disconnect between the interests of shareholders who own a wider portfolio, the entire economy, potentially, and a sector which has an interest perhaps in not transitioning. That is perhaps the short-term interest of a fossil fuel company, and that's rational economically for them in the short term, versus shareholders who do need a transition to occur for macroeconomic reasons. So this is, I think we're going to have to recognize that the companies so far have not shown a willingness for a primarily renewable-driven energy system, an electrified transport system, greater mobility, reduced, vehicular transport in general. They don't engage with that conversation in a very serious way. We've gone from, fossil fuels to, coal needs to go. I mean, that is the level of progress that we've gotten to with the oil majors. They have produced some documentation looking at a more climate-friendly world, but when you interrogate that documentation very closely, Shell's so-called Goldilocks scenario has a huge disclaimer right in the beginning saying they're not using it for making investment decisions. BP does produce in the last couple of years more scenarios, including a faster transition scenario, but labels the other one the most likely scenario. And they see the future as gas. And again, when you look at the climate science, the role for gas is limited if we're to achieve Paris.
Very, very clear analysis. And the ethical implications of the positions that they currently take, betting on the world going beyond 2 degrees, are very significant because of the implications from the climate science of going beyond 2 degrees in terms of floods and droughts and everything. So I think there's a real cognitive disconnect there between the Paris Agreement and its findings and the way that the global economy is thinking about the future. And as you say, you see that all the time in the official reports and the scenarios, including the latest BP 2017 one that's just been published. To which they would probably say, well, it's governments in the end, and if governments really put a new framework in place, we will shift. But then they lobby the governments to prevent that happening. So it's very hard to see how to cut through this unless we globally create some kind of movement of informed citizens and pension holders and the like that effectively makes such a clamour within our democracies, but also within our pensions, that things begin to shift fast at the scale required. And as an individual pension holder, I have been engaging it to this end myself and finding it quite difficult. And yet, I write my letters, I make my case, and I'm listened to, and I'm told that I'm one of a very small minority who are pushing for this, and therefore it's unfeasible at the moment for the company to shift its scale. Just trying to work out how we cut through all of this.
Yeah, I mean, it is very challenging, and pension funds often have hundreds of thousands of members in them, and so even though you might have a very engaged grouping, they may at most run to hundreds of that very engaged grouping, or maybe a few thousand. And the pension funds will then say, well, we can't move because 3,000 people care or not. I think I divide again. I step back and I go financial versus ethical. So climate risk is a financial issue.
Yes.
It's a huge financial issue. It should not need a single member or a single customer to flag that to the attention of anybody in power for them to act on it. They're failing in their duty if they're not considering the financial implications of that. They're getting away with that failure because climate change is a medium to long-term impact, and so we're not seeing it. But eventually that crisis will occur, and you will be able to track back, just as you can track back on the financial crisis, to individual decisions made which have led to that failure. So on financial issues, which climate risk is, there needs to be much more involvement from the regulatory bodies. And so that's why, in a way, that Client Earth Share Action moved to contact the regulators, with members actually providing the evidence for that. It was members writing to their funds, being unhappy with the answers, and then sort of saying, what can we do about this? The regulators need to get more involved. People need to be held responsible for not taking into account those issues which they are obliged to take into account when acting as fiduciaries or under a duty of care in a financial services contract with the customer. Litigation is being seen around the world in various forms, like litigation against governments in the Netherlands for failure to set particular emissions targets. We're seeing here the UK government facing litigation for air pollution targets. Germany, in Munich, a court decision yesterday, again, upheld a win the Client Earth had, which may see a diesel ban. So I think what we need to see is informed citizenry and civil society looking at if you're thinking as a campaigner, it's what's the power analysis here? Who has the power? And what levers of intervention can be pulled? And I think where people are clearly failing in a duty, we should look to the regulatory intervention points. Litigation against pension fund trustees is challenging. I think it will happen eventually, but it's challenging because you need to suffer loss. And again, climate change is not having the impact now, but we're sowing the seeds of the destruction that will eventually occur. So I would encourage people to think about the options as well as contacting your fund directly, particularly when it's financial, and because they are failing in their duty to take these measures into account. On terms of ethical issues, where something is purely ethical, maybe you're concerned about holding tobacco or something. I mean, that can also have financial impacts, but maybe in a particular situation it's purely ethical. That is more challenging because you're going to have to bring more people with you. So you need a more informed citizenry, just generally. The global political landscape is many things at the moment, but it is in flux, shall we say. And it does cry out for and demand a more engaged citizenry. Mm-hmm. And to purely rely on institutions to act in our best interests is somewhat optimistic at the moment. And that's not a call for revolution, it's simply a call for participation in democracy and a reassertion of expertise and a reassertion of what is actually rational, long-term best interests behaviour. And so, although the political situation globally presents huge challenges to us at the moment, it also highlights very clearly the problems, and again, to speak in campaign language, very clearly draws the battle lines. And so the opportunity is there for people to step forward and declare at the starting point what it is they want, and then find allies, hopefully within civil society organisations and grassroots movements, who can help direct that declaration into an intervention point, which will bring change. But I think we must, on climate particularly, completely get away from this notion that it's purely ethical. And I think continued high oil demand is good news for the oil majors sector. So if you just hold Shell, BP, Total, Eni, and so on, and runaway climate change is probably good for your dividend checks in the very short term. But no one just holds the oil majors. And Therefore, what about your consumer goods companies who see Southeast Asia middle class development as the future of their business? There will be no Southeast Asia middle class as climate exerts. So these institutions need to be pushed, I think, on things like that. How are they thinking about their portfolio as a whole? You say it doesn't make financial sense to sell these companies, but then you hold, consumer goods companies. And I do think we need to push them on lobbying, because as you said, oil companies with some legitimacy say, we don't make the rules of the game. The governments of the world make the rules of the game. We abide by the law. They need to change the rules of the game. But then they spend billions of dollars every year around the world, sometimes directly, sometimes very often indirectly through lobbying groups and trade associations, arguing against precisely the measures which would bring about change. So a tangible example of that is in California, one of the world's largest economies on its own, one of the world's largest car markets on its own, sought to introduce measures which would have driven down oil demand. That was the purpose of it. And part of that was the electrification. Electric vehicles would be promoted. And a trade association, the West States Petroleum Association, spent millions of dollars lobbying against that rule, and not only lobbying, but advertising, running adverts for the general public, suggesting that the California government wanted to take away people's SUVs to generate, grassroots opposition to this measure. BP and Shell are both members of that association. When they were asked at their annual general meeting how, on the one hand, they talk about wanting the world to act on climate, and on the other hand, lobbying against this measure, BP's response to it was they weren't familiar with the measure. Now, it's incredible if a major oil company is not aware of a measure in one of the world's largest economies, which would have led to a reduction in oil demand. That's another issue that investors might want to question. But there is this huge disconnect between their rhetoric on the one hand and their actions on the other, and I think we just need to call it out. Another big part of their rhetoric is, well, you got to tackle climate change, but you got to help the poorest people in the world, and this is all about development. And I mean, really sort of positioning themselves as, the saviors of the world's poor, which, with my campaigning hat on, is sort of sickening, really, when you look at what the resource curse has done to some of the world's poorest people. But this is very much part of the messaging that we hear from companies. And in that instance, it was great to see the Elders Group, write a letter saying the greatest threat to development was climate change, and we needed to decouple progress from carbon. So I think we need to see people who operate in different spheres, who have different personal interests maybe. So some people may be more concerned about, they don't necessarily think they're interested in fossil fuels or stranded assets, but they are interested in developing world, the global south, emerging markets, equity. All of these issues play into climate, all of these issues play into stranded assets. The great big sort of theory of change that kind of I operate on is, I do think we would have had far more political progress on climate were the power of the fossil fuel industry not so entrenched. That power is political. The current, I think, Chief of Staff of the UK Civil Service is a former BP man. Rex Tillerson is the Secretary of State of the United States of America. They're individually politically entrenched and organizationally politically entrenched. They're economically entrenched. They employ tens of thousands of people around the world. Very important employer. The Treasury makes a lot of money out of petrol tax and car fuel. So they're economically entrenched. They're big parts of our pension funds, big parts of our stock exchanges, big dividend payers, and they're culturally entrenched. Everyone knows an oil company just because the garage and petrol station's down the road, and then they go out of their way to sponsor everything all over the place. Usually lovely things that have royal or national in the title, again, to very much establish themselves as part of the national infrastructure. And so one cannot imagine life without them. And that's not accidental. And so I think we need to have more people imagine life without them, and then work to have life without them, in the sense of politically that they cannot, just as tobacco companies by a UN convention cannot lobby on public health measures in signatory countries to that convention, why can oil companies lobby on climate-related issues when we know the burning of hydrocarbon fuels is the biggest obstacle we have to tackling it. So we need to remove them from those political processes. While we're waiting for that formalization, people need to tackle it. There's great organisations like Influence Map exposing the lobbying activity. People need to challenge it. We need to be imaginative. Are MPs meeting with oil companies? Are they on APPGs that are inviting oil companies to talk and call that out? And economically, the work you're talking about, do you want them to be in your pension, challenging pension funds around what they're doing around the oil companies? And then we have a very vibrant and successful Art Not Oil coalition in the UK, the liberation of Tate, which they helped secure. And again, that is all, posited as pure philanthropy. And we know from Freedom of Information requests that, the sort of opening nights and wine receptions at these events are used to do deals, and invite, and that's again rational behaviour. It's not surprising to me or outrageous to me, but it is very clear that some of our greatest national institutions are being used to promote companies whose decline must occur to prevent the decline of the human race.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise. I had one last question for you. What can you do as an individual, as a pension holder? What one thing would you suggest to readers and listeners to think about doing? So
I'm going to give a promo to my old firm, because I think they do great work. So Share Action is an organisation that exists to help individuals hold their pension funds accountable. Whatever it is those issues are that are important to you, they facilitate individuals meeting with their pension funds. They have an online database which allows you to email your pension fund directly. So if you are interested in these issues but don't know where to start, I would suggest that you email or call Share Action or go on their website, because they will have the tools to get you started. They will also show you how you can do things and how you can make things happen. And I've spoken a lot about the size of the system and the small size of people who are potentially active. So people may be sitting there going, but I'm one person, I can't do anything. Share Action is lots of one persons, and it's that joining together that can make it happen. If you're also, supporter of other groups, 350, if you can join those groups to help divest. If you're interested in, your church, there's faith groups. Christian Aid is doing work around getting churches to go renewable energy, to divest their own holdings. So this isn't necessarily the big, Church of England pot. So I think if you're not involved at all in this space, reach out to Share Action. If you are engaged with any other civil society grouping, think about asking that civil society grouping about what they're doing in this space. And you'll be, I think, pleasantly surprised to hear a lot of civil society groupings, whether it's Oxfam or Christian Aid or Greenpeace, are doing lots of work in this space. And you as a supporter could indicate that you want them to continue to doing that. Because what we do need is the big movements of civil society to come on board this. The movements that have, millions of people on their databases. And they are supporter-led. And so individuals saying to, the Avazas, the 38 Degrees, the Greenpeaces, the WWFs, the foes of the world, I'm interested to know what you're doing around around finance and climate. That will help continue that work in those organisations.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Louise. Wonderful to talk to you.